let's talk about prohibition. But before we get into this, I just want to say thank you for being awesome. Thank you for subscribing and thank you for watching these videos. It means more to me than you'll ever know. In order to understand how and why the United States went from completely fine with people drinking to not fine with people drinking, we have to do a little bit of backtracking. Okay, so all the way back in 1917, a group of people known as the Anti-Saloon League spent years and years drafting up a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would prohibit the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol. But they didn't just do this because they were like, you know what, I hate fun. They did this because they were very concerned about the social ills that they saw alcohol bring with it. And by social ills they mean a whole bunch of things, but most specifically that alcohol was at the root of all domestic abuse and all poverty and all sorts of other societal issues that nobody could really figure out what they were at the time. So they said, well, it must be alcohol's fault, which wasn't necessarily true, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that after years of drafting, redrafting, and campaigning, on December 18, 1917, Congress passed the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. And once the states ratified it in 1919, it became law. And this was great for those people who wanted to stop people from drinking, but it was bad for those people who liked to drink. Now, even though the 18th Amendment made it illegal to drink, it didn't necessarily make it illegal to drink at home. You just couldn't buy it anywhere, or have it shipped anywhere, or have it made anywhere. You could still have it if you had acquired it before January 17, 1920. So a lot of people bought a lot of alcohol right before this date went into effect. And then some smart Alecs even decided to open up businesses selling homemade alcohol. Now these businesses technically weren't allowed to sell alcohol because that was now illegal. So instead, they had to get creative, and they started calling their businesses something else. And that something else was usually a front for their real business, which was making and selling alcohol. And these places became known as speakeasies. Now, it's important to note here that, while technically illegal, these speakeasies had to abide by a few different rules. First and foremost, they could only serve people who were over the age of 21. Second, they couldn't serve more than 2 drinks per person per visit. And third, they had to close between the hours of 3 a.m. and 8 a.m. Oh, and another thing too, they couldn't actually sell any alcohol. The customer had to bring their own. So basically, think of it like having a friend bring beer over to your house to drink. That's what it was like going to a speakeasy. You brought the booze and they provided the fun. Now, there are a couple of other things that you need to know about these speakeasies. First, they were often connected to organized crime rings. See, since the government wasn't taxing alcohol anymore, these organized crime rings saw an opportunity to fill that void. So when organized crime rings started making their own alcohol, they created entire underground networks of breweries, distilleries, and distribution systems. In fact, there was one guy named Manly Sullivan whose family smuggled in 3,000 bottles of Canadian Club whiskey from Canada every single month. And Manly sold his liquor through a chain of 60 different speakeasies in New York City alone. And second, they were often hidden in plain sight. Remember, this is right smack in the middle of the Roaring '20s. A time where people loved to dance and listen to jazz music and just generally have a good time. And the best place to have a good time was at a speakeasy. So naturally, these businesses had to kind of fit into the culture of the time. So a lot of them disguised themselves as other businesses like restaurants, piano bars, clothing stores, or even pool halls. In fact, one of the most famous speakeasies of all time was disguised as a funeral home. And speaking of disguise, this leads us to our next important point. Getting into a speakeasy was no easy feat. These places were heavily guarded, and getting in you usually had to know the right password, or give the bouncer a secret handshake, or have a membership card, or sometimes all three. And if you got thrown out, you couldn't go back in for at least a week. So if you were going to a speakeasy, you had to be committed. Now while all of this was going on, another industry was also popping up, the bootlegging industry. Bootleggers were usually members of organized crime rings, and their job was pretty straightforward. They made and sold illegal alcohol. It was that easy. Okay, well, not that easy, but it was pretty easy, you know. I mean, depending on how much alcohol you wanted to make and sell, you might need more than one guy to help you. So yeah, it's not like it was brain surgery or anything, but it was profitable and dangerous work. See, When the 18th Amendment was passed, all of those people who used to make a living legally selling alcohol, like brewers and distillers and winemakers, they didn't just suddenly decide to stop making alcohol. They just had to find a new way to make and sell alcohol. And since making and selling alcohol was now illegal, these guys were forced to join organized crime rings in order to continue making a living. And as you might imagine, these organized crime rings were led by some pretty colorful characters like Arnold Rothstein, aka the most dangerous man in America, Frank Nitti, aka the man who owned Chicago, and Lucky Luciano, aka the man who built modern-day organized crime. So basically, under the guise of the Volstead Act and the help of some very corrupt politicians and police officers, these guys started smuggling alcohol in from other countries, often Canada and Mexico. They started making fake IDs so they could buy alcohol in other states, and they started bribing everyone they could think of so that they would not get arrested for making and selling alcohol. And while all of this was going on, another industry was also growing rapidly, the casino industry. Now, casinos weren't exactly new. People had been gambling in America since before it was America. But before the 1920s, gambling was mostly reserved for the wealthy. But during the 1920s, thanks to the rise of organized crime, gambling became much more accessible, much more legalistic, and much more profitable. And while all of this was going on, another industry was also growing rapidly, the prostitution industry. Now, prostitution wasn't exactly new either. In fact, it's one of the oldest professions in the world. But before the 1920s, prostitution was mostly relegated to the seedy underbelly of society. But during the 1920s, thanks to the rise of organized crime, prostitution became much more accessible, much more legalistic, and much more profitable. So basically, what I'm trying to say here is that organized crime was running rampant during the 1920s, and it was all because of alcohol. Now, obviously, this couldn't last forever, and eventually on December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment was passed, which repealed the 18th Amendment, thus ending Prohibition. Now, there's a lot of debate as to why this happened. Some say it was because organized crime had become too powerful. Others say it was because people had become too accustomed to just ignoring the law. Still others say it was because the Great Depression had made people desperate for money. Whatever the reason, the 21st Amendment was passed and alcohol became legal once again. Okay, so now let's take a minute to look at some of the lasting impacts of Prohibition. First and foremost, it created a whole new generation of criminals. Organized crime was practically non-existent before Prohibition, but it exploded during it, and many of the biggest names in organized crime today can trace their roots back to this era. Second, it led to a massive increase in the consumption of hard liquor. Before Prohibition, most people drank beer or wine, but during Prohibition, hard liquor became the drink of choice, and this had a lasting impact on American drinking culture. Third, it made alcohol much more expensive. Before Prohibition, alcohol was relatively cheap, but during Prohibition, it became very expensive. And this is because of all the middlemen that were involved in the production and distribution of alcohol. When alcohol was legal, it was much easier to produce and distribute, which kept prices low. But during Prohibition, it was much harder to produce and distribute, which drove up prices. This led to a situation where people who were used to buying beer or wine regularly were now only able to afford hard liquor. And finally, it left a lasting legacy of distrust between the government and the people. Many Americans felt like the government had violated their civil liberties during this era, and this led to a general feeling of distrust that has lasted for decades. Okay, so now let's finish this off with a little bit of trivia. What was the first state to ratify the 18th Amendment? That's right, it was Tennessee. Alright, so now let's finish this off with a little bit of reflection. Is this something that you think should have never happened, or do you agree with the sentiment behind it? Let me know down below. Also, please subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help me out a lot. And as always, thank you for watching. Is the banning of alcohol, prohibition, about to make a comeback in the United States? It was enacted in 1920 and lasted until 1933. It was not very effective at all, and there were all sorts of unintended consequences that resulted from the attempt to ban alcohol. But could it happen again? So I've been thinking about this because we've talked about drugs and we've talked about alcohol before on this channel. And I keep getting comments from people who say things along the lines of if they could just ban alcohol or ban all drugs, then we would solve all of our problems. And while I understand where they're coming from, I think that's a pretty naive view of how the world works. And I think those people are sorely mistaken. But let's just play it out for a second. Let's pretend that they could do that. They could wave a magic wand and ban all drugs or ban all alcohol. What would happen? Well, first of all, the people who want to consume those things would still consume those things. Alcohol and drugs would just go underground. You would have black markets. Crime would increase as a result of that. Gangs would proliferate. There would be turf wars. People would be killed. The unintended consequences would be enormous. And also what you would have is a massive amount of people who would lose their jobs. Think of all of the people who work in the legal and regulated environments, whether it's casinos or bars or restaurants or liquor stores. All of those people would be thrown out of work, and then they would have to resort to selling alcohol illegally in order to make money. And then what would happen is, you would have all of these sort of mob-run establishments that would basically become the only source of alcohol, and they would sell it at exorbitant prices, because they can since there's no competition. And then what would happen is that you would have a lot of people who would say, hey, I used to be able to go to the bar and get a beer for $4. Now I have to pay $20 for it because these guys are gangsters and they control the market. So maybe we should legalize alcohol and regulate it so that the prices don't go through the roof. So that's what would happen. I think that the idea of prohibition in the United States or anywhere else in the modern world is just completely absurd. I mean, it's not even something we should even consider as a policy option. And the reason why is that there are too many people who would be harmed by it, whether it's the people who work in the industry or the people who consume it. I mean, people who consume alcohol occasionally, are they really harming anyone? No, they're really not. Are they harming themselves? Maybe, but that's their own decision. So the government has no business trying to tell people what they can and can't put into their bodies. Now, of course, there are certain things that we as a society draw the line on. And those are things like, hardcore, like meth and stuff like that. Things that are very addictive and very harmful. We can all agree on that. But when it comes to things like alcohol and even marijuana, I think that we shouldn't have a government that is trying to tell us what we can and can't do. I think that we should be free to make our own decisions in that regard. Now, some people might say, well, what about drunk driving? Isn't that a problem? And of course it is. But that's a matter of public policy. You can address drunk driving without having to prohibit alcohol. You can raise the drinking age. You can make the penalties for drunk driving worse. You can require ignition interlocks on cars. There's all sorts of things that you can do to address drunk driving without prohibiting alcohol. So prohibition, it's off the table as far as something that we should even consider as a policy option in this country. I think it was a complete failure the first time, and it would be a complete failure if we ever tried it again. So that's my take on the matter. Let me know what you think in the comments. Would you vote for a prohibition amendment if it were on the ballot tomorrow? I'm very curious to hear your thoughts. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.